I will ask the panelists, please, for very, very brief comment, and then I'll go directly to the participants, and then ask the two of you to respond to all of them together, please, again, very briefly. Okay, this time we'll start with Jeff. Oh, hold on. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just say half of what I was going to say. I'd just like to pick up on this point of prediction, which has come up, that there are a number of different kinds of prediction. There are the so-called point predictions of traditional science, where you predict that the system will be in a particular state at a particular time in the future. And that, of course, is impossible in most of the systems that we're interested in, because they are sensitive to initial conditions and other things too. There's the issue of prediction of subspaces, so that the system won't be in any particular state, but it'll be in a known set of substates, and you can perhaps attach probabilities to that. And then there's another kind of lack of prediction, which is you can't even know what the future will hold. So that somebody in the 19th century could not have said anything sensible about the internet, because they couldn't even have imagined it. So there are kind of prediction horizons, and I think that what we try to do in terms of complex socio-technical systems, we have to understand that there are horizons to what we can actually sensibly say about them.
Go ahead. Yeah. Okay. Right. First of all, when I I really enjoyed the talk very much, because it did link hard science and soft science in a way that some of us certainly will appreciate very much. When I heard the definition of patents, which in a way I've never really looked at, I thought, my God, that's for a mechanical world. That's a mechanical world view. It's bound to fail. It's bound to be trouble. Because, apart from anything else, molecules fold. I mean, even the very building blocks of our bodies are made of folded enzymes, and they can fold in multiple ways. And in fact, you're up the creek. I used to walk around in the 80s doing origami to demonstrate emergent properties of folding. And that's what molecules do. So you're really in trouble, about patenting the consequences. And what are you patenting? I mean, it's quite okay. Number 3, transparency worries me, because I feel you'll never get it. So in a way, maybe our problem might be, how do you live when you can't get transparency? And the other thing is that evolution and change, if we consider it to be a good thing, is often driven by ignorance and is restrained by knowledge. In other words, channeling conventional views and so on lock you in to a view, whereas ignorance very often is you do things. I changed my subject completely without any knowledge of the consequences of doing it. Anyway, okay, so ignorance is not a bad thing always. So that's a point about it. And I have a lot of that to share with you. The final comment is that the real problem, as I see it, is that we've moved from a multi-dimensional evolved world of many worlds in parallel, not just geographically, but socially. So we used to have academe, theatre, literature, music, and business. But there were many worlds, and you could excel in an academic world, and it was nothing to do with how much money you made. And the real problem is we've reduced our world to one world where money and business is everything. So we've put music, literature, academe, all into business, and we've got this measuring stick of finance. So the whole problem about patenting is linked to that problem. And so that is our fundamental problem. But you may not be able to solve that one.
Thank you.
Alex? I'm going to touch upon what Jeff said before about prediction. And although you dismiss prediction completely, I've seen in your last slide about realistic disaster scenarios. Yeah. So, in a sense, this is the only thing that we can do. Yes, we cannot predict the behavior of a complex system, but at least we can study it as much as possible and try to develop scenario of possible behaviors. Our aim of intervention there is not to completely change the partially differential equation that's unsolvable, but perhaps certain factors that will move the system towards a direction different from the one that we don't want it to take. Hoping that it will take a better one, hoping that it will evolve in a way which is favorable, but not do anything.
I would also like to add one of the points I think that I would agree with you in your last slide when you mentioned self-regulation as well as a tighter regulatory framework. I think it's necessary to have both, because if all we do is react now under the current circumstances with a much tighter top-down regulatory framework, I think that will have more serious consequences. I think we need to create the environment for very active, participative self-regulation, and the two are absolutely essential. Brian? No point. Okay, so open to the floor. Yes, sir. Please say who you are, where you're from, and then your comment or question, and please be brief.
Ben Sykes, the coordinator for the UK National Stem Cell Network. I think Aurora's animated presentation shows you what a dog's breakfast the patent system in stem cells turned out to be. And it was a real systems failure, and that's quite dangerous in a brand new field, which may yet prove to be the greatest revolution in medicine since transplant surgery. It's interesting that the network intervened because Aurora came to the network, and the solution actually proved quite simple. So we intervened, and rather than changing the system itself, which remains inherently complex, what we have done is bolted on an information management solution. So it's not a policy solution, it's just an information management solution, which is quite simple. And we are now negotiating with the UK IPO to have a monthly patents digest provided to the community online, with basic bibliographic information so that they know exactly where to go by patent number for something they're interested in. So, complex problem underneath, not changing the system, but bolting on quite a simple solution.
Can I just comment on something?
Yes, okay.
Can I just add a comment? Because I didn't get the opportunity to mention this in the slides, but why it is so important for the community, the scientific community, to be appraised of the existence of an application in the system is that the system actually allows for representations to be made by the public to the patent office after publication of the application. So there is, in effect, a window of opportunity for for experts in the field to intervene and hopefully, raise the quality of patent scrutiny in patent offices, because clearly patent examiners are limited, in their field of expertise, particularly in areas which are very fast evolving. So this is another, kind of reason why the transparency of the system, kind of fast, accurate, up-to-date publication is absolutely crucial to improving, the workings of the system. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Two little questions. One, doesn't alternative splicing actually make part of this process redundant or obsolete already? Or is that part of the process? I don't know if the stem cell guy can help with that. The other is, in terms of biological networks, you do get these nodes, the regulatory nodes. Presumably we've got that as well in the regulatory management, and that's perhaps where you concentrate in making your interventions or your leverage points.
May I say to Nidhi Brunel, Business School. I think sometimes I just want to pick up with from what Eve said, that we need both voluntary and the real regulation from authorities, from the government. Sometimes what is missing, not only in this scheme but in other ones, is the link between the two. So the interaction between the two. And sometimes by building these interactions is what is missing, and it might give us a solution. Thank you.
Joyce Tate. I hate to add further complexity to what's already a complex situation, but I'm aware of a potential conflict which is kind of lurking in the background of all of this in the stem cell area. And that's the and it could erupt in quite damaging ways. And that's the tension between the open source community, the free public access to new ideas, new products, new stem cell lines, and the patenting of these stem cell lines. And because I'm on the Scottish Stem Cell Network board, I'm aware of some of the tensions that are arising around this question, and also of the way in which it's almost becoming an ideological debate and not influenceable by rational argument. And I think that's quite a dangerous situation to be getting into. I wonder if you've thought about that in this context.
Oh, right.
You was first, actually.
All right, you go first.
Yeah, I guess, actually, sorry, Alan Pottage from the law school here at the LSE. I guess, for me, your question or your presentation does centrally go to the question of what we mean by complexity.
By what, sorry?
What do we mean by complexity?
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
Your presentation goes to that question of what we mean by complexity and what should we be saying about it. In the sense that if you start from a very basic question, looking at your theme of transparency and efficiency and so on, and ask what is a patent, or what is the text that you circulate, which is the claims of the patent. From one perspective of complexity, a social scientific one, one would say that text is actually several different artifacts at the same time. It's an economic artifact, it's a legal artifact, it's a scientific artifact. And to isolate one of those artifacts or one of those themes, if you like, thematizations of the patent, is to simplify the complexity right from the start. I mean, if you look at the 19th century, in the US, where, of course, mechanical patents were the norm up until about 1890, the legal take in patent claims and in patent infringement litigation was such that actually machines became phenomenally complicated things in law, not necessarily in science. So there is a radical difference, a radical heterogeneity between the different observational standpoints or the different things that these texts can be. And my question, I guess it's an observation more than a question, is that I think if one takes the classical view of patents, which you do, which is an economistic view, and one instrumentalizes them, this is what they are for, one effectively flattens the complexity out of patents. So the interesting question is, from a social scientific complexity perspective, is how do we actually start to analyze the cognitive or discursive differentiations that are involved in a patent? And I fear that if one goes down that route, actually transparency and efficiency are not necessarily what patents are about. They've never been about that, as you both know. I mean, if you look at 19th century classical patents, everybody's involved in playing games with claims and games with examiners and trying to hide things and so on. But that turns into a bigger question, actually, about the kind of way in which the theme of this seminar seems to be going. It seems to be very much how do we instrumentalize, how do we regulate, how do we influence, how do we control? There is another question, I guess, from a social scientific perspective, and that is, one, what is involved in that way of thinking about complexity? Why are we adopting this aesthetic of instrumentality as a way of thinking about complexity? And second, let's have some reflexivity. What is involved in these kinds of normative modeling? But patents are a perfect example of that. Sorry, I've spoken a long time.
Alec Robertson. I'm actually from the art and design sector, so slightly out of my field. But I am interested in prediction and the nature of the way that science fiction writers can try and predict the future, but always get it wrong in terms of forms. But what does seem to happen, in my view, is there's a kind of co-evolution between what a science fiction writer predicts and the actual goal setting of people. So there's this kind of continual metamorphosis of the goal and the invention. And I suppose it's relevant here is that in the question of global governance of new health technologies is what technologies are predicted and desired, and how does that set a goal, and what actual technologies result which are patented. And there's just an anecdote there which I thought I'd say.
Okay, I've got a long list here. Right, Jeff talked about subspace predictions can't now. So I can't remember what you were saying, Jeff. Tell me what you said again. I've read most of the notes, but you're saying, point-wise, probabilistic subspace predictions. What was the point? Yeah, I agree with all that.
Horizon.
The final point was that you don't even know what's...
Oh, fine, absolutely. I completely agree, absolutely. Could have black swans. I think that the timescale is absolutely vital. Relating to the last point from Alec about technologies, I think the reason this is so important is we think it's just about gene expression or stem cells. Actually, all the new technologies are going to suffer from this characteristic because they are, by their nature, all going to be relating to this type of complex system. So if the thing itself is going to be part of a complex system, then the way in which we deal with intellectual property relating to it, we've got to find a way around this. Now, whether I agree with the sociologist, was it Alan at the back? Alan? About, I think you've got to be instrumental. I'm sorry. I think, I come from a practical world where, we want to make money. I'm totally against whoever said, who was it? Peter, who said, money's a bad thing. I think money's great. I think greed is good, and I think ignorance is bad. Very simply put, I just think it needs to be regulated. So, you can have your reflexivity if you want, but I think we're dealing with a real-life problem. People want to innovate, they want to create new product, they want to make money. Money drives the world. Let's be realistic about it. Idealism helps, but money drives the world. That's my view. I didn't put up my sort of card-carrying capitalism up front, but, that's how I think we've got to be practical and look at it. So that dealt with a few.
Can I just
what would you like to...
my own view on this, so that I am not associated with this money-grabbing culture. And just clarify that, what brings us together, I suppose, as you said correctly, is a kind of brutal pragmatism that, from my perspective, the patent system is here to stay. And so, to some extent, these ideological debates, which, as I think Joyce correctly said, underlie, ultimately, the different perspectives on intellectual property, whilst they're extremely, important, nevertheless, will not resolve the real, very practical, world we have to live with, which is that, intellectual property is there; it's going to stay, and so, what I'm really interested in finding out is how we make the system work better, than it is, so that we don't end up with these extravagant kind of rights being granted left, right, and centre to, players who ultimately, just are abusing, the system. So I have a very kind of pragmatic interest in this issue, whilst at the same time, and I would want to make room to others, who want to look through the lens of complexity at the social kind of organisation of science to reflect on how we move forward.
I wasn't saying one shouldn't, but in the context of this talk, which is about the practical, I'm afraid, patents are done.
Yeah.
They may be for the benefit of society, but they're actually to protect the inventor for their commercial gain. Just to take Peter's point about transparency, I quite agree about the folding proteins and so on. It's really a huge problem, even forgetting the quantum theory of it. You said you can't get transparency on the system. I suppose in principle that's true, but it's such a mess at the moment and it's so incompetent. We know search engines can be a lot better than that. We know the latency of the time taken to get them into the database could be massively reduced if these people are even half competent. We know that matters a lot by the evidence that the gentleman at the back, Mr. Sykes, said, which is, having that information from on stem cells is helpful. So I thought that was good, except I think ignorance is not good. The question Alex pointed about scenarios, absolutely. I think one of the lessons we've learned about the financial crisis, there's a measure called value at risk used by the regulators and by companies to assess their capital adequacy. They're completely blinded by the mathematical models. All these quants with their blooming PhDs and their mathematical models using Gaussian, curves and Markov chain Brownian motion. They got it all wrong. It was always known this was a defunct thing, but unfortunately it wasn't in their interest because they were all conniving to produce a value-at-risk measure of capital adequacy when they should have asked the really simple question was, if the housing market goes pear-shaped, how much are you down, boys? And that's the question we now ask in insurance. We didn't ask 20 years ago, and Lloyd's nearly went bust. And that's why we put realistic disaster scenarios into our work. I completely agree with Eve and the lady May who said about self-regulation and regulation. Regulation stifles things. Self-regulation, I'm afraid, won't work in itself. The right way to do it is to do it in a cooperative manner, and it can work. And yesterday I gave a talk in the morning to a self-regulatory body in the insurance industry, looking how we could help ourselves by producing a new generation of claim systems worldwide. And that's not a regulator telling us to do it. In fact, the regulator was present, listening to it. And that seems to me to be a very practical way. The lady who talked about the biological networks nodes, I think that's very important. The node behavior is crucial very often. If you can get to that, then you can understand the instability. Joyce, I don't know about that stem cell stuff. I think there is ideology getting in the way, and people look at patents and say, you shouldn't have property because I'm a communist. You're not allowed to have property, therefore patents are evil. Well, they can take their views if they want. I take the view we've got it. We've got to make it work. I think ideology, if we're not careful, even my capitalist one, just simply gets in the way of it, and that's why we try to avoid it in our talk. It just doesn't help you. Now, I think there is a separate debate, but it's not our one to have about ideology and how you deal with that. I just think if we had more practical measures and people were more, sort of brutally pragmatic about this, we'd get to solutions that would benefit us all. That's my view.
Okay, thank you very much.
Oh,
yes.
I was going to add something, but never mind. That's fine. That's fine.
No, it's just that I've got a comment from the back, and then.
Could I just go back on Joyce? I think the problem.
Hold on a moment. Can you just get the.
Stem cells is a new field, and the patent system has been stacked in favour of the industrial companies applying for the patents. And in a system where we can't rely on the patent examiners for lack of expertise to do their job in quite the same way that they have with conventional drugs, for example, and other materials, you've got to have a system where others can challenge. So that the patent system works as it should do. And it's the transparency issue that enables that process to happen.
We could talk about this over lunch, but I think I wasn't talking about the patent system being more open. I was talking about an open source ethos, which makes all of it freely available and prohibits patenting, prohibits intellectual property. And I think that can be problematic sometimes.
Okay, I think Aurora wanted to have just a final word.
Just very briefly, and it ties in with the comments made by Peter about him not realizing that the patent system had actually been devised for a mechanistic era. And indeed, this is a comment that's been made, that was made by scholars. It was devised, to deal with engines, motors, and brake, not living, kind of cells, and so that there is. I think you're absolutely right. Fundamentally, the system is under strain because the concepts, which is actually are supposed to provide the boundaries, are actually do not fit, the kind of object that one is looking at, and that is a fundamental issue, which is why I think there is a need for outside intervention within, to try and draw those boundaries, because otherwise what we have is a series of legal fictions which have been perpetrated and applied by patent offices, and quite frankly do not connect to reality. So that's the challenge.
Yes.
Yeah,
I think
I agree.
That's an absolutely fundamental point on which to end this particular session, in that the original patent scheme was designed for a linear, mechanistic, complicated world, but not to the complex areas that we're working with at the moment. Please join me once more to thank both Aurora and Peter.